Identifying customer requirements. This is segment 3 of applying methodology to a design. Identifying customer requirements. So this includes assessing the scope of network design project, identifying required information, extracting initial requirements, gathering network requirements, planned application and network services, organizational goals, organizational constraints, technical goals, and technical constraints. When assessing the scope of a network design, you need to consider the following. So whether the design is for a new network or is a modification of the existing network. So usually, design nowadays are usually an upgrade. Okay? So very seldom that we start a network design or network implementation from the scratch. So whether the design is for the entire enterprise network, a subset of the network, or a single segment or module. For example, the designer must ascertain whether the design is for a set of campus LANs, a WAN, or a remote access network. So whether the design addresses a single function or the network's entire functionality. Examples of design that would involve the entire network include one of which all branch offices, LANs, are upgraded to support Fast Ethernet or Giga Ethernet, and a migration from traditional private branch exchange or PBX based telephony to an IP telephony solution. So basically, a project to reduce bottlenecks on a slow one is an example that would likely affect only wide area network. So adding wireless mobility, okay, or provisioning core redundancy are designs that would likely affect only the campus. So the Open System Interconnect or the OSI reference model is important during the design phase. The network designer should review the project scope from the protocol layer perspective and decide whether the design is needed for only the network layer or if other layers are also involved. So for example, the network layer includes the routing and addressing design. The application layer includes the design of application data transport, such as transporting voice. The physical and data link layers include decisions about the connection types and the technologies to be used, such as gigabit Ethernet and other technologies. So the table here exhibits sample results of assessing the scope of design for a sample enterprise, say Corporation X. Okay, so this includes the scope of design, the entire network, okay, the network layer, or focused on the data link layer only. Identifying required information. So determining requirements includes extracting initial requirements from the customer and then refining this with other data that has been collected from the organization. So extracting initial requirements, well, initial design requirements are typically extracted from RFP, okay, or the request for proposal or request for information or RFI, okay? So these are basically coming from the customers. So an RFP is a formal request to vendors for proposals that meet the requirements that the document identifies. An RFI is typically a less formal document an organization issues to solicit ideas and information from vendors about the specific product. So the first step in the design process should be pre-documenting, sifting, processing, reordering, translating, and so forth. Okay? So the design requirement and reviewing them with the customers for verification and approval. Obtaining direct customers' input in either oral or written form. That's very important. Now, the figure here illustrates an iterative approach to developing the design requirements document. So the figure illustrates the following steps here. So first, extract the initial customer requirements from RFP or RFI. Okay? And then second, query the customer for verbal description of the initial requirements. And then third, okay, produce a draft document that describes the design requirements. Next would be fourth, verify the design requirements with the customer and obtain customer approval. And the last one would be fifth, revise the document as necessary to eliminate errors and omissions. So steps 2 to 5 are repeated if the customer has additional comments about the draft document. Identifying required information. So this time, gathering network requirements. So as illustrated in the figure, the process of gathering requirements can be broken down into 5 steps. Right? So during these steps, which are sometimes called milestones, the designer discusses the project with the customer staff to determine and gather the necessary data, including appropriate documentation. So step 1 would be identify the planned network applications and network services. Step 2, define the organizational goals. 3, okay, so which is determine the possible organizational constraints. 4, determine technical goals. Okay, and then 5, determine the technical constraints that must be taken into account. Okay, now these steps provide the designer with data that must be carefully interpreted, analyzed, and presented to support the design proposal. So throughout these steps, the designer takes thorough notes, produces documentations, and presents the findings to the customer for further discussions. Planned application and network services. So the designer must determine which applications the customer is planning to use and the importance of each of these applications. So using a table here helps organize and categorize the applications and services planned. So the table should contain the following information. So you've got the planned application types. Okay. So this includes email, okay, groupware, okay, tools that aid group work, okay, voice networking, web browsing, video on demand or the VOD, databases, file sharing and transfer, computer-aided manufacturing, if applicable, okay, customer support, and others. So applications, specific applications that will be used, such as Microsoft Explorer, for instance, or Microsoft Edge, the Cisco Unified Meeting Place, okay, Zoom, and others. So you also have level of importance. Okay, so the importance of the applications, whether critical or important or not important, that should be noted. Okay, and the last column here should be your comments, additional notes taken during the data gathering process. Now the table here shows an example of data gathered about the planned applications for the sample company, which is the Corporation X. Okay, so for email, application would be using the Microsoft Outlook. Okay, that's important. For groupware, something like in this example, you've got the Cisco Unified Meeting Place. Okay, that's important. So some comments. For web browsing, you've got the Explorer, Opera, Netscape, and others. So video on demand, databases, and customer support. The planned infrastructure services table is similar to the planned application table. Okay, so it lists infrastructure services that are planned for the network and additional comments about those services. So recall that the infrastructure services includes security, okay, quality of service, NM or the network management, high availability, IP telephony, and mobility. So software distribution, backup, directory services, host naming, and other authentication and authorization are examples of other services and solutions that are deployed to support a typical organization's many applications. So the table here shows a sample data that was gathered about the infrastructure services planned for our sample company, Corporation X. So for security, deploys security systematically. Okay, so firewall technology to protect the internal network, virus scanning applications to check incoming traffic for viruses, intrusion detection and prevention systems to protect from and inform about possible outside intrusions. Also on security, consider the use of authentication, authorization, and accounting systems to ensure that only authenticated and authorized users have access to specific services. Okay, so next would be the quality of service, or the QoS. So implementation of QoS to prioritize more important and more delay-sensitive traffic over less important traffic. So that means higher priority for voice and database traffic while lower priority for HTTP traffic. Okay, next would be network management. Introduction and installation of centralized network management tools such as the HP OpenView, okay, with Cisco Works applications for easier and more efficient network management. You can also use other network management tools available. Okay, now for high availability, use redundant paths and terminate connections on different network devices to eliminate single points of failure. So we have a lot of technology being used for high availability. Okay, you just have to review your basic networks about these terms and technologies being mentioned. So next would be IP telephony. Okay, the voice, okay, company wants to migrate to IP telephony. Okay, and then for multicast, IP multicast, introduction of IP multicast services needed for the introduction to video conferencing and e-learning solutions, okay, should be considered. So you also have mobility, okay, so need mobility for employees and guest access for clients. So all of this would be planned application network services. Next would be organizational goals. Every design project should begin by determining the organizational goals that are to be achieved. Okay? So the criteria for success must be determined and the consequences of failure understood. So network designers are often eager to start by analyzing the technical goals before considering the organizational goals and constraints. So however, detailed attention to organizational goals and constraints is important for a project success. So in discussions about organizational goals, the designer obtains knowledge about the customer's expectations of the designed positive outcomes for the organization. So both short and long-term goals should be identified. Okay? Now, this organization-centered approach allows the network to become a strategic asset and competitive weapon for the customers. So preliminary research of the organizational activities, products, processes, services, market, suppliers, what else? Competitive advantages, and structure enhances the positioning of the technologies and the products to be used in the network. So this is an opportunity to determine what is important to the customers. Okay? So some questions or sample questions a designer might ask to help determine organizational goals includes the following here. So you could ask this to your clients. Okay? So what are you trying to accomplish with this project? What businesses or business challenges are you currently facing? What are the consequences of not resolving these issues? So how would you measure the quality or the quantity success if you could fix or correct the identified problems and issues? What applications are most critical to your organization? What is the major objective of the project? What is driving the change? Do you need to support any government or safety or legal mandates? What are your main concerns with the implementation of the new solution? What technologies or services are needed to support your objectives? Okay? What other technology, projects, and business initiatives will affect your group in the next 2 to 5 years, for instance? Okay? So what skill sets does your technical staff currently have? And what is your goal for return on investment, or the ROI? Okay? So organizational goals differ from organization to organization. Okay? So the following are some typical goals that commercial organization might have. So increase the operations generated revenue and profitability. So a design or a new design should reduce cost in certain segments and propel growth in others. So the network designer should discuss with the customer any expectations about how the new network will influence revenues and profits. Next would be shorten development cycles and enhance productivity by improving internal data availability and interdepartmental communications. You could also improve customer support and offer additional services that can expedite reaction to customer needs and improve customer satisfaction. Okay? So open the organization's information infrastructure to all key stakeholders, prospects, investors, customers, suppliers, partners, and employees, and build relationships and information accessibility to a new level. So take note that similar, though not identical, goals are common to governmental, charitable, religious, and educational organizations. Most of these entities focus on using available resources effectively to attain the organization's goals and objectives. So in not-for-profit organization or those who are non-profit organization, key measures are typically stated in terms of cost constraint or containment, service quality, service expansion, and resource deployment. So this section emphasizes the deployment of networks in commercial organization as an example of the type of research required for establishing a network requirements. So to illustrate the importance of considering organizational goals in the network design, so consider two manufacturing enterprises that are contemplating network updates. Okay, so for instance, Enterprise A, main reason for change is to improve customer satisfaction. It has received many complaints that customer information is difficult to obtain and understand, and there is a need for online ordering capability. Okay? Now, in contrast, Enterprise B is given by the end of the system maybe to reduce cost. Okay? So this is a mandate from, for instance, the CEO. So when design decisions are made, these goals will most likely result in different outcomes. So for example, Enterprise A might choose to implement an integrated product information database with e-commerce capability, whereas Enterprise B might not see the value of investing in this technology. Okay? So following are examples of the types of data that can be gathered about some common organizational goals. Okay? So this includes increased competitiveness. You have to list competitive organizations and their advantages and weaknesses. Okay? So note possible improvements that might increase competitiveness or effectiveness. Reduce cost. Reducing operational costs can result in increased profitability. So even without a revenue or increased services with the same revenue. So list current expenses to help determine where cost could be reduced. Okay? Next would be improve customer support. Customer support services help provide a competitive advantage. So you have to list down current customer support services with comments about possible and desired improvements. Okay? And another thing would be add new customer services. So you have to list down current customer services and note future and desired or requested services coming from the customers. Now, the table here presents data gathered about organization goals of a sample company, Corporation X. Okay? So, you've got Corporation Y, Corporation Z. This is the existing situation. You've got some comments here, right? So, reduce cost, improve customer support, and add new customer services. Okay? So, document everything. Organizational constraints. So when assessing organizational goals, it is important to analyze any organizational constraints that might affect the network design. So some sample questions the designer might ask to help determine organizational constraints includes the following. So you could ask this, okay? What in your current processes works well? What is your current processes does not work well? Okay, which processes are labor intensive? What are the barriers for implementation in your organization? What are your major concerns with the implementation of a new solution? Okay, so what financial and timing elements must be considered? What projects already have budget approval? This is very important. Okay. Are other planned technology projects and business initiatives compatible with your current infrastructure and technology solutions? Okay. What qualifications does your current staff have? Do you plan to hire more staff? Okay, if so, for what roles? Do you have budget for technical development for your staff? And are there any policies in place that might affect the project? So you have to ask this on your clients, okay? So assessing organizational constraints. So typical constraints includes the following. So you've got the budget. Reduced budgets or limited resources often force network designers to implement an affordable solution rather than the best technical solution. So take note of that, okay? So this usually entails some compromises in availability, manageability, performance, and scalability. Okay? The budget must include all equipment purchases, software licenses, maintenance agreements, staff training, and so on. So budget is often the final decision, okay? So to make by the higher ups. Okay, so budget is often for design elements, selected equipments, and so on. So the designer must know how much money is available to invest in a solid design. So it's also useful to know the areas in which the network can be compromised to meet budget requirements. So as always, budget is a challenge. Okay, next would be personnel. The availability of trained personnel within the organization might be a design consideration. Organization might not have enough trained personnel, or they might not have enough personnel. Familiarity with both the equipment, okay, and technology speeds, deployments, and reduced cost, and trained technicians must be available to verify that all network elements are working. So therefore, the designer must know the number of availability of operation personnel, their expertise, and possible training requirements. Okay? Additional constraints might be imposed if the organization is outsourcing network management. The designer must consider the following implementation and maintenance phases which require adequately trained staff. Okay? You also have to consider policy. Organizations have different policies about protocols, standards, vendors, and applications. So to design the network successfully, the designer must understand these policies. So research is very important. Data gathering is very important. So for example, the designer should determine customer policies related to single vendor or multi-vendor platforms. An end-to-end single vendor solution might be a benefit because compatibility issues do not restrain the network. So that is a challenge for the designer. Okay? So as another example, many organizations such as the government agencies, for example, defense departments, have strict policies preventing implementation of proprietary protocols. So take note of that. So as always, being a designer, I always emphasize on using open systems, open protocols. Okay? The good thing about proprietary protocols is that these protocols are customized for the device. For example, EIGRP is customized for Cisco. Okay, but OSPF is also working fine with it. All right? So those considerations should be part of the planning. Okay? Next would be scheduling. The organization's executive management must discuss and approve the project schedule to avoid possible disagreements about deadlines. So for example, the introduction of new network applications often drives the network design. The implementation time or time frames for new applications are often tightly connected and therefore influence the available time for the network design. So a lot of considerations needs to be assessed, needs to be considered. Now, table here shows an organizational constraints and accompanying data that has been collected for our sample company, Corporation X here. So the budget, okay, and the personnel, all with certifications, policy, okay, the policy should be a standardized protocol, so no proprietary protocol to be used, and of course the scheduling, which is very important in project implementation. Technical goals. So the technical goals of the project must also be determined before the design starts. Some sample questions the designer might ask to help determine technical goals includes the following. So what are your technology priorities? How does your technology budgeting process work? What infrastructure issues exists or will exist related to your application rollout? What skill sets does your technical staff need to acquire? Okay. So does your current network have any performance issues? Which portions of your network are considered mission critical? Or do you anticipate significant growth in the number of network users over the next few years? So I always give emphasis on this. Whenever you design a network, do not design it based on the current requirement, based on the current criteria. You always have to consider the future expansion. So think 5 years or even 10 years from now. Okay? And then how is your network managed now? Technical goals. The following list describes common technical goals. Okay? So improve network performance. An increase in the number of users and the introduction of new application might degrade network performance, especially responsiveness and throughput. Okay? The first goal of network redesign is usually to increase performance. For example, by upgrading the speed of links or by partitioning the network into smaller segments. We call it network segmentation or VLANs. All right? So take note, performance is a general term that includes responsiveness. throughput, and also resource utilization. The users of network applications and their managers are usually most sensitive to responsiveness issues. Speed is of the essence. So the network systems managers often look to throughput as a measure of effectiveness in meeting, okay, the organization's needs. So executives who have capital budget responsibility tend to evaluate resource utilization as a measure of economic efficiency. So it is important to consider the audience when presenting performance information. So you have to speak their language. Okay? So next would be improve security, okay, reliability of mission critical applications and data. So increased threats from both inside and outside the enterprise network require the most up-to-date security rules and technologies to avoid disruptions of the network operations. Okay? Next would be decrease expected downtimes and related expenses. So when a network failure occurs, downtime must be minimal, and the network must respond quickly to minimize related costs. Okay? So you also have to modernize outdated technologies. The emergence of the new network technologies and application demands regular updates to and replacement of outdated equipment and technologies. Okay? So the lifespan of the equipments should always be considered. Next would be improve scalability, okay, of the network. So networks must be designed to provide for upgrades and future growth. Simplify network management. That's also one. Simplify network management functions so that they are easy to use and easily understood. So using a table helps the designer identify technical goals. Different goals have different levels of importance, which the customer should determine. Okay? So one way of expressing the importance is with the percentages. Specific technical goals are rated in importance of scale from 1 to 100. So with a sum totaling 100, of course, this scale provides direction for the designer when choosing equipment, protocols, features, and others. Now, the table here depicts the desired technical goals that were gathered for the sample company, Corporation X, along with the importance ratings and additional comments. So in this example, the designer sees that the customer places great importance on availability, okay, scalability, and performance, okay, so which is 20. This suggests that the network design should include redundant equipment, redundant paths, and use of high-speed links and so forth, okay? So you could check other videos related to this technical items like availability, the protocols, high availability, and others. Technical constraints. Network designers might face various technical constraints during the design process. So some sample questions the designer might ask to help determine technical constraints includes the following here. Okay? So first, how do you determine your technology priorities? Do you have a technology refresh process? If so, is that an obstacle or does it support the proposed project? What urgent technical problems require immediate resolution or mitigation? Do you have a plan for technical development for your staff in specific areas? Or do any applications require specific network features like protocols, okay, routing protocols, ACLs, and other security, okay? Now, using the table can facilitate the process of gathering technical constraints. So the designer identifies the technical constraints and notes the current situation and the necessary changes that are required to mitigate a certain constraint. So here's the table. Okay? A good network design addresses constraints by identifying possible trade-offs, such as the following. You've got the existing equipment. The network design process is usually progressive. Legacy equipment must coexist with the new equipment. Okay? You also have bandwidth availability. Insufficient bandwidth in parts of the network where the bandwidth cannot be increased because of the technical constraints must be resolved by other means. Okay? You also have the application compatibility. If the new network is not being introduced at the same time as the new applications, the design must provide compatibility with the old applications. Okay? You also have lack of qualified personnel. Lack of qualified personnel suggests that the designer must consider the need for additional training. Otherwise, certain features might have to be dropped. For example, if the network proposal includes the use of IP telephony, but the network administrators are not proficient in IP telephony, it might be necessary to propose an iterative solution. Okay? Now, the table here presents a sample technical constraints gathered for our Corporation X. So under existing equipment, okay, the designer notes that the coaxial cabling in the LAN physical cabling plant still exists and comments that the twisted pair and fiber optic should replace it. So there might be, or there is a need for an upgrade on the infrastructure. Okay? Bandwidth availability indicates that the one service provider does not have any other available links aside from 64 kbps WAN links. So the organization should consider changing to another service provider, that being the case. Okay? And then application compatibility suggests that the designer should take care when choosing the equipment. So this should support IPv6 based applications. So to summarize, the PPDIOO approach reflects the lifecycle phases of a standard network. The design methodology under PPDIOO includes these processes. So first, identifying customer requirements. Okay, so we covered this, characterizing the existing network and sites, and designing the network topology and solutions. So take note that each of the phases has corresponding deliverables. So key steps in identifying customer requirements includes identifying network applications and services, defining organizational goals and constraints, and defining technical goals and constraints.